Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rowan Pitts, Executive Director here at the Australian Chamber of Commerce in South Korea. It is my pleasure to welcome you to AustCham Korea's special industry roundtable, The Future of Mobility, with our co-host, the Global Green Growth Institute. This video is part 2 of 4 with today's special guest speaker, Adeel Ahmad, Intralink's Project Director, who will be touching on key mobility trends within Korea. If you wish to watch the full version of this roundtable, please follow AustCham Korea on YouTube or click on the link within the description. Thank you.
Sandra, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think what I'll be doing is just really quickly walking you through some of the key mobility trends that I've seen over the past, let's say, year or so, or even the last several months here in Korea. Just a quick maybe explanation of what it is that Intralink does before we get started. We are a business development consultancy that helps companies, typically North American or European tech firms, do business in Korea, China, and Japan. Those you can see we have offices all across Europe, Australia, and Israel as well. And really what we offer is a chance to explore strategic markets in Korea, China, or Japan in a fast and effective way. And the way we do that is through the contacts that we have across the large groups in Asia, including in Korea, of course, the key players in the mobility space. When I talk about mobility, I think obviously you can look at it in a lot of different ways. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll be talking about automotive, specifically looking at autonomous vehicles, ride-hailing or ride-sharing, as well as micromobility, and UAM, also known sometimes as a vertical takeoff and landing, or VTOL. Just a quick overview of mobility in Korea. I think Korea is, of course, well known for its strengths in the automotive sector. Obviously, the presence of the Hyundai Motor Group, Hyundai, Kia, Genesis, but also its strengths in connected cars, thanks to, I think, the excellent infrastructure, the widespread deployment of 5G. Before that, of course, 4G, the high smartphone penetration rate, I think extremely high spending on R&D. I think if you look at number of patents filed or the percentage of GDP spent on R&D, I think Korea is among the top 3 or top 5 globally. So all these things combined, I think some of these legacy strengths in automotive, as well as the strengths in its tech industry, make Korea, I think, a very interesting testbed for various mobility applications. And then I think what makes Korea quite attractive for various applications within mobility is the fact that a deal with Korea is potentially a global deal if you're able to sell into Hyundai, or maybe just stepping outside slightly the mobility box. If you're selling into a Hyundai, an SK, an LG, that deal has the potential to be a very large deal. One maybe an interesting note on mobility in Korea is that there is a very limited presence for ride-sharing platforms, whether that's global platforms such as Uber, or maybe even a large national platform such as what you see with Didi in China. And then finally, there's significant influence on mobility through government industrial policy. An excellent example of which is the $186 billion Korean New Deal, which was announced last year, which aims at kind of a very large-scale decarbonization of all aspects of the economy, if not society. And here is a look at the key players in the mobility sector. Some of these are, of course, quite well known. Some of them are perhaps a little bit unexpected. So I think Hyundai is perhaps known around the world. Kakao, if you've spent some time in Korea, is quite well known. I think it's best known for, obviously, its messaging platform, its kind of cute emoticons, but I think it leverages its strengths in messaging, in kind of its mapping app, then its taxi hailing app, to create this large platform through which it can introduce other services. I think recently they announced, looking at potentially logistics and deliveries as well. I think a couple of startups to highlight. 42 Dot is a company that is quite active in managing autonomous vehicles. StratVision, which is a Korean startup, I think now largely in the US. It's a client that Intralink has worked with in both Japan and in China. And they offer, as the name suggests, vision systems for autonomous vehicles. And then maybe a couple other names. UT is a joint venture between SK Telecom and Uber. Doosan, Hanwha, Hyundai Mobis are some of the larger manufacturing groups. Mobis is one of the largest tiers. And then Korean Air, obviously, is the well-known national carrier, but they have recently expressed interest in looking at some of the urban air mobility applications, the so-called flying taxis. Excuse me. So the first trend to highlight is major investments in autonomous vehicles. The sector, of course, as I mentioned, is dominated by companies within the Hyundai Motor Group. 6 million vehicles sold annually worldwide. Hyundai has announced plans to have all its vehicles connected by 2025, and that's driven by from Hyundai, a massive $116 billion investment in future mobility technologies. And the goal to touch on, as Jeff mentioned, is to commercialize level 4 in the coming years, and that's backed also by 1.3 billion in government funding. And obviously, it's not just the OEMs. You've got telcos and tech companies such as Naver Labs active in the space, as are the tiers. The picture you see there at the bottom is a KT connected car. Obviously, it's a Hyundai car, but operating on KT's connected car infrastructure at a autonomous vehicle testbed site in Hwaseong, south of Seoul. The second trend to highlight is that ride-hailing seems to be finding a way. So Korea, in some sense, has been a graveyard for ride-sharing. Uber tried in 2013, 2014, but the fact that they were not using registered cabs, led them to withdraw from the market. Tada tried later on, 2018 to 2020, using a loophole where you could hire vans with at least 11 seats if they weren't taxis. That loophole was closed. Kakao floated the idea of a carpool, and I think around the same time, 2018, but withdrew in the face of protests. Now, Kakao obviously is dominant. Kakao's Kakao Taxi, I think now it's called Kakao T. It's dominant in the cab hailing space. SKT's T-Map is another competitor. But you're also seeing now a joint venture between SK and Uber, UT, which I mentioned earlier, and that's working with taxi companies in this cab hailing space. And then car sharing app SoCar, which is one of I think the larger unicorn startups in Korea, is also entering this ride hailing space. The third trend to highlight is urban air mobility, which is taking off. I think one thing Korea does very well is new technologies that perhaps are slightly in the realm of science fiction. So there's a government-led urban air mobility project aiming for flying cars by 2025. Realistically, I should say flying taxis by 2025. And you've got some major players: Doosan, Hyundai, Korean Air. Doosan is a large manufacturer. And then you've also got some defense contractors leveraging their strengths in aerospace. I think it's something that a lot of big groups here see as offering significant potential for future growth over the long term. Testing will begin in 2022, and the idea is that by 2025, you'd have taxis flying from central Seoul to Incheon Airport. The fourth trend to highlight is micromobility. I think the rapid growth in recent years, and then over the past year or so, some regulation in the sector. So if you've spent some time in Seoul over the past couple of years, you have probably seen people on these scooters, which are, I think, a very convenient way to get around town, especially at rush hour when the traffic is quite backed up. It's something that both local and national governments have invested in different ways. Both as part of general transportation, eco-friendly policies, as well as I think targeted projects as part of smart city projects. Scooters are quite dominant, as are bikes. The number of scooters doubled in the past few years. I think estimates vary, but I think the number in Seoul alone is about 60,000. And it's I think a market where there's a lot of players active: Kakao, Wind, Lime, Xingqing. But what we've seen in the past year, especially, is that I think just because there's so many bikes, so many scooters now, there's now regulations in terms of requiring helmets, in requiring people to have driver's licenses if they're going to operate a scooter, as well as fines on, I think, both users and carriers, if they're parking illegally. So those are the key trends I wanted to highlight, and then maybe I'll just touch on some of the success stories that we've seen in this space for our clients here in Korea, and then I'll also maybe just touch on some of the challenges related to doing business, particularly when it comes to mobility in Korea. So I think just in some general terms, areas where our clients have found interest and have really succeeded in kind of some broad terms without naming names would be core technology for fuel cell electric vehicles, sensor technologies both for autonomous vehicles as well as UAMs, and then finally we had a company that offers remote operations for autonomous vehicles, doing fairly well. Now, if we look at some of the challenges when it comes to doing business in Korea, I think overseas, if you can broadly express, this is the pain point that I'm trying to address, and here's what we're hoping to be able to do in 2-3 years' time. I think that is something where customers and investors are interested in working with you. I think in Korea, you really need to have your I's dotted and your T's crossed when it comes to the technology. As customers, these large groups will really want to do a deep dive into the technology, how it works, what are its limitations, what are the applications that it's best suited for. So it can be quite detail oriented very quickly. Another challenge is the lack of a local presence. I think obviously in Australia, the time zones are not as much of an issue. Obviously, the distances and so it can be obviously not speaking the language and doing business from overseas, whether that's time zones or the distance. And then finally, regulatory challenges. So we've seen in kind of different cases that we have a client with an interesting technology, but as Uber saw, I think that's it's quite a well-known case. The regulations in Korea, looking at things quite maybe nitty-gritty as frequency bands or standards that the government has mandated for different sectors, those don't match up with what overseas companies may offer, even though the technology may be stellar and quite ready for the market. So that is really the presentation that I had prepared. I hope this was informative, and I look forward to continuing the discussion during the Q&A. Thank you.